the people of sake actually brought me into sake.
Back in 1988, this place was actually in Ginza on the main drag.
At first it was kind of soy sauce, it was miso.
To the point where it actually changed my life.
New Year's Day 1989.
Not just sake as a beverage, but all the culture and history.
Welcome back, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Sake on Air, the world's first podcast dedicated to expanding the dialogue surrounding Japan's iconic beverages, sake and shochu, and of course, awamori. Our show is made possible with the support of the Japan Sake and Shochu Makers Association. My name is Frank, and today I'm joined by Eric Rath, a professor at the University of Kansas, who's been studying Japanese food for more than 20 years. How you doing, Eric?
Oh, great. Thanks, Frank. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, or maybe I should call you Professor Rath?
No, it's okay.
Eric okay?
Eric's fine. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Cool. Good deal. So I'm really excited to have you on the show today to talk about your new book, Kampai, The History of Sake. Would you like to explain it, or should I take a shot at explaining what the book is about?
Well, in a nutshell, it's a history of sake. There you are. But more than just sake. I mean, of course, I'm going to talk about the origins of sake, and I take us through sake in Japan from ancient times, medieval, early modern, but I also look at the consumption side. So how people appreciated sake, and how sake influenced literature, how sake influenced restaurants. So I have a chapter on izakaya and the history of those, sake pubs. And my last chapter looks at sake's spread abroad in the United States and in Europe. And I had a chance to talk with a lot of brewers in the United States, and that was really a fun aspect of the project to research.
Why sake? What prompted you to write the book?
Well, I mean, besides the fact that sake is Japan's national traditional alcoholic beverage, as a food scholar, you butt into sake all the time, you know? Sake is really important for samurai ritual. Sake is something that's offered to the deities. Sake is important in banqueting historically. And, just the economics of sake are also really important. Yet, in English, at least, there was really not a great history of sake that I could find. I mean, I could find lots of good works, books by like John Gartner and others introducing sake, like what to buy and how it's made and things like that. But, the nitty-gritty details of sake's history and where it came from, how it changed over the decades, that was missing. So I thought, here's an opportunity. No one else has written this book. I'll write this book.
Yeah. And I was very lucky. You sent me an advance copy and I got to read it. I thought it was super interesting. But it was also kind of frustrating because there's so much made about how sake is like Japan's traditional beverage. Koji making and traditional brewing has become a intangible UNESCO World Heritage. But like, basically, one of the first things that I got from the book is that we don't really know how it kind of came to be in the very beginning.
Right. Yeah. There's lots of myths, lots of stories. And that's because there's an absence of information. And part of it is because of, like you said, koji, this mold. How do you write a history of a mold? Mold doesn't really show up in the archaeological record. So when did people started using koji? Well, you can use some historical sources for that. And you find those back in Japan in the 8th century. And of course, they're using koji earlier in China. So that's one thing. But was that the first sake? We have references to alcohol in Japan from the 4th century. What are people drinking? That's a big question. Is it a wine? Well, maybe not, because if you look at the native grapes and fruits, they're not well suited for wine in Japan. And there was really no winemaking industry in Japan until, the late 19th century. So wine's out of the question. Probably some kind of sake. How do they make it? Well, of course, the big myth is that they're chewing brewing, right? There's this thing called kuchigami sake where people would chew the grains, release the amylase. The amylase in their saliva releases the starches in the rice and produces alcohol. And lo and behold, we have one, we have one reference to that in ancient times in Japan. And a lot is made of that. Is that the origin of sake? Well, mm, it could be, but that's hard work. It's hard work on the teeth. And, it's unlikely it's going to produce very good sake, maybe 2% alcohol by volume.
Uh-huh.
And then there's all sorts of myths surrounding that it was made by virginal women, things like that,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
which are totally made up
Uh-huh.
later on. So that's a possibility, but we really don't know. I mean, when koji came to Japan, is koji something that came over with rice? I mean, that's possible, but you know, I can make koji here in Kansas if I take some corn leaves. Is that what we call them? I can't remember the name. And then we take some steamed rice and wrap them up. The husks of the corn. That's what it is. Husks of the corn. If I wrap them up and leave it, koji's going to grow. Or maybe some very toxic mold will grow. You have to be very careful. So
Interesting.
don't try
Okay.
this at home.
Yeah.
You could hurt yourself. But it's universal. In other words, koji. So it's really hard to trace that early history.
Is that, as a food researcher, is that like one of your white whales? Is to like go poke around some person's kura in the middle of Japan in like their warehouse and find a random book that's a copy of a book of a copy of a book that's like in 1603, a Chinese delegation came to Japan with something like koji. Is that like a dream, or is that just something that we should give up on?
Yeah, it's possible that document exists someplace. Maybe not in Sakekura, but could be buried in the ground someplace. But lacking that, you just have to see what's available historically and interpret it correctly, or try to. And it amazes me that a lot of scholars have just kind of let their imaginations run when it comes to early history of sake. They place it in the ancient period, I mean, or excuse me, the prehistoric period when there's no rice or any other grain. They come up with all kinds of crazy theories, when in fact, we don't have the evidence to support them. But I think there's a feeling that there's a story to be told there. You got to fill in something. Japanese have always loved to drink,
Yeah.
and so there must be some ancient prehistoric alcohol consumption and production going on. And so there's a lot of theorizing about that, or fantasizing rather.
I was struck by your descriptions of the drinking parties in early Japanese history in like the Heian period and kind of before the Edo period. Because it sounds a lot like a frat kind of drinking party, not like what you would assume aristocrats and like warriors, samurai warriors are going to be doing.
Yeah, people are getting ripped. I mean, in a lot of the source. But the thing is, the tricky thing is that who's writing, at least the literature in the period, is are the great women authors like Murasaki Shikibu and others, and they're very reticent about talking about sake. So you have that huge text and translation, the Tale of Genji, which is 1,000 pages or more, and the word sake comes up like 13 times. Yet
Wow.
if we study, a little bit other documents, we know there's a lot of alcohol consumption going on. There's a lot of people who are drinking too much to the point that it's impacting their health. Um, but yeah, there's this consumption, but on the other hand, there's this sort of taboo of writing about it. But we can kind of see in moments that there's a lot of drinking going on, even in the tale of Genji, because Genji gets drunk and uses that as an excuse to stay over at somebody's house so he can seduce their daughter, you
Yeah.
know. And then reading ahead in the book, his son does the same thing.
But
Must
it's
have been an
not.
old trick.
So, like, if sake isn't actually mentioned that often, is it just euphemism and we know what the euphemisms are, or?
Well, the term is not used, but certainly we learn from the setting that people are drinking a lot,
Uh,
at least in the literary sources. Um, But yeah, the term and there's several terms that are used. I mean, there's sake that's used, I think, and then this word miki, which is tend to be used for sake when you offer it to the deities. But yeah, it's really curious. And also, if you look at those sources, people don't eat it all. They must have been eating,
Hmm.
but there's not a lot of discussions of people like having a meal. That too is taboo.
Interesting. Would that be, do you think that that's connected to like ideas of what it means to be a good person at the time? And it's like you don't want to be talking about that kind of thing? Or is it something more specific, like this is just not worth talking about in the way that like you don't show if you're shooting a movie, you're not showing the main character using the restroom unless it's important to the story.
Right. I think a little bit of the latter. People don't see it as so central. I mean, now any Japanese drama you turn on television, food and drinking, I mean, are so central to it. They help define the characters. It's really baked in, but that's a completely different idea set than ancient literature, where food is rarely discussed at all, or drinking for that matter.
When does drinking start to be really talked about then in that like and expressed in literature?
Yeah, I think in the medieval period was when we get into it. We see that in works like Sorezoregusa by Yoshida Kenko. There's a lot of like body wild drinking scenes in that of monks getting intoxicated and putting barrel or pots on their heads and then they can't take the pots off. Hilarity ensues until someone loses a nose, having to rip the pot off. They take the nose and the ears off the poor guy.
It's like it's Brothers Grimsby almost. Like it's pretty gory of a story.
Yeah, that's a pretty gory one. But then we also see in literary depiction, or excuse me, visual depictions of banquets, some really wild scenes. People drinking, taking their shirts off, dancing around, vomiting. The whole culture of sake consumption changes in the medieval period. I think it's because sake is more available,
Mhm.
and we also have sake being such an important part of warrior culture, samurai culture, from the 14th century on. It's important to taxes. It's important to samurai ritual, and to banquets. And people are drinking copious amounts too at these banquets.
Are those depictions more like for common people, or I feel like The Tale of Genji is a book written by an aristocrat for aristocrats, where I know in the Edo period things become like a lot more popular culture style of consumption of media, but in the kind of before the Edo period, even as sake drinking goes up, as the economy becomes a thing, is that also because like more people have access to reading about the consumption of alcohol and having that experience and like being excited about that? Is my understanding like correct or on the right path?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the sources they tell the story of the elite, so it's hard to access, what the commoners are doing. We have glimpses, we have glimpses in images of sake makers and koji makers from the 16th century. And in both those instances, by the way, they're women who are producing sake and koji.
Huh.
So in that way, we see the common folk, or at least we see a representation of the common folk. But yeah, it's really hard to access what they're doing because, the records just aren't as plentiful and not as descriptive for ordinary people. Um, and that's just kind of a fact of life. But as you said, like when we enter the Edo period after 17th century, the number of sources just blossoms and we have a much better understanding of like what ordinary folk are doing.
And when did women kind of stop being part of the sake industry? Did it ever fully stop, or is it kind of complicated?
Yeah, it's happens when sake production really ramps up in the early modern period. In the medieval times, you got two different types of breweries. You have temple breweries and you have sort of mom and pop breweries. And Kyoto has hundreds of these mom and pop breweries. And the mom and pop breweries, they're making sake year round. They're producing it in large ceramic containers and they're selling it on premises. So if you wanted sake, you go to the brewery. And some of these breweries become famous and they distribute a little bit, but mostly it's just local. So production is small scale, but when production gets ramped up, sake becomes also a seasonally produced beverage,
Hmm.
and you need a large workforce. The workforce that's available are farmers and fishermen who are in the off season, in the winter months when sake is produced, and it's very labor intensive. And at that point, yeah, women sort of step to the background. I'm sure they're still involved in sake production. You know, if a family owns a brewery, someone's going to make food for the brewers,
Hmm.
and someone's got to keep the records. And it's just that women are not mentioned in the sources, and that's not true just for sake. It's true for so many things. You know, especially in the early modern period, the position of women deteriorates socially and politically and economically. So, for example, in the medieval period, the word shokunin, which means artisan, if you look at images of artisans, you see lots of women. But in the
Okay.
early modern period, shokunin, artisan becomes a male term. So,
Oh.
yeah, it becomes much more patriarchal after the 17th century.
Is that just because of like Japanese society becomes a bit more stable and more centrally controlled, or
Yeah, that's part of it. Society becomes a little more repressive too in the early modern period with sumptuary rules, for example. Technically, in the 17th century, peasants couldn't drink or brew their own alcohol. You know, I'm sure that was never enforced,
okay,
but on the books, at least, they're not supposed to do that kind of thing. So yeah, early modern is just a little more repressive than medieval. Medieval is a little more free floating and free.
interesting. So you got, I remember in the book you talk about kind of the difference between doburoku, what we now call doburoku, and what we now call like sake or nihonshu. And were they ever thought of as the same thing, or has it always been kind of separate, different kinds of beverages?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of bleeding back and forth between the two of them. You have brewers in early modern times. Sometimes they make a doburoku, sometimes they make a sake. You know, it just depends on what their customers want. Um, they can take the same base recipe and turn it into a sake or turn it or sell it quickly as a doburoku. I think there's a lot of ambiguity between the two terms. Except, doburoku tends to be made more quickly, probably made year rounds, made locally in Edo. It's a cheaper beverage in that it's something that if you looking to save some coins, you buy Doburoku rather than sake. The distinction between Doburoku and sake really happens at the end of the 19th century when the government initially they're licensing home brewing,
Mhm.
but then they put a stop to it and Doburoku goes underground. And that's something that's prohibited and it's legal. And in Japan today too, you can't legally homebrew, as you know.
Yeah.
So that's when I think there's a much firmer distinction. But before that, there's a lot of ambiguity between the two beverages.
How specific are people when they are like if for example I'm reading a book written in 1830 and they use the Japanese word sake, do they just use the character for alcohol? Do I just need to know based on context clues of like, oh, this person is in this level of society and generally has this amount of money, so it's probably going to be what we call sake, or it's probably going to be doburoku. Like, how do you know? Or were people being like pretty specific about what they were drinking in terms of alcohol?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it really depends on the source. You know it's going to be sake because although there are other types of alcohol available, there's shochu, there's some wine, there's some beer floating around, but really 99% of what's consumed for 1900 is sake.
Hmm.
So it's going to be sake. But a lot of depends on context. And in some courses, some sources, they will say, I'm ordering Doburoku or I'm ordering what they call in Edo, which was now Tokyo, they order White Horse.
Hmm.
So they go to izakaya and you don't order by brand name, you order by the amount you want to pay or quality. And so like the lowest quality is the White Horse, and that's the Dobroku. And if you want to pay a little bit more, maybe you get more elevated sake and pay a little more for it. So there is that sort of distinction. If it's, a term that appears in warrior documents or rich merchant class, I'm sure they're drinking sake. They might even say, where the sake is coming from, because as you know, there's a lot more prestige to sake from the Nara area, and, Osaka, Kobe than there is in local stuff. They hate the local stuff in Edo.
Okay. And that's just because it tastes different, or is it more of like an image problem?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's hard to know what it exactly tasted like. I think a lot of the sake that was produced in that period, it would be rough for us, but the sources say that it tasted terrible. It was
Okay.
just like the bad brew, the local bad brew. And there was really attempts by the warrior government, the shogunate, to improve brewing in the area because they didn't want all these sake imports coming from Nara. And they tried and they tried and they just couldn't kind of find that secret sauce to make the sake good. And of course, they're also fighting against the traditions of Nara brewers, and those had been established for several centuries by the 19th century. So, yeah,
Why? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead. That's fine.
I was going to ask why would it be an issue for the government that the Nada brewers were shipping sake to Tokyo?
Well, the samurai government is really strange about its economics because they really don't understand supply and demand, you know? So, for example, they pay their samurai in rice.
Hmm.
If you're a samurai, you get a little token twice a year to go get some rice. And when the price of rice is high, then you do really well. But when the price of rice is low, even against other commodities like miso or something like that, then it's hard for the samurai. And so the government really can't figure out why this is the case. So they're always trying to kind of tweak the system somehow, but in a way that just doesn't make much sense. This is, I think, where this idea of producing sake in Edo locally to offset the Nara brewers comes in because they see that as unnecessary spending. Why are people spending all these amounts on sake from Nara when they should buy something locally? You know? And there's something to be said for that. But of course, consumers have their own mindset about these things. And consumption in the Edo period is very odd in some ways by modern standards. People will pay enormous amounts of money for like the first skipjack tuna that comes on the market, and the first hot katsuo. Like, wow, they'll spend hundreds of times what that is worth a week or two later.
I mean, that's kind of how it is now with the tuna auction, right?
Well,
A little
it's
bit.
true in some extent, or that melon, the first melon that comes on the market, from some great grower will command a lot of money. But there's things like that, that drive consumption that just drive the warrior government crazy. They
Mm,
hate that kind of thing because it's useless spending.
yeah.
And so I think they're trying to control commoner spending, but they're just not able. They don't have the fine-tuned tools to do it. And so they do these kind of crazy schemes. They'll ban sake sometimes, or they'll tax it. And then inevitably they'll walk back those rules because of demand.
There's lots of laws about sake in the that are talked about in the book that seem to be very granular and specific. But it also kind of seems like, based on what you just said now too, the laws exist but are not necessarily followed most of the time.
Yeah. Well, in the early modern period, who 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 is responsible for enforcing the laws? It's the commoners themselves. So the government will have the village head or the head of the city ward bring everybody together and read the law. And then you can just imagine folks in the crowd go, uh-huh, uh-huh, yeah, okay. And then they go off and they do their own thing, you know,
Mhm.
and they just tell each other, just don't flaunt it, keep it cool, keep it on the lowdown. We can keep growing, we can keep making our tofu even though we're not supposed to do that. We can keep, having a good time. Let's just not kind of be made an example of, because that's what you're always worried about is
Yeah.
Someone's going to come along and make an example of you for wearing purple or something like that. So you, instead of, wearing it so openly, you wear it in the inside of your haori, your
Uh-huh.
cloak,
Yeah.
That's very decorative, but on the outside it's very plain and you can pass in the street and look like an ordinary person.
I wanna go back real quick to something that you said. So tofu was also banned or regulated?
Yeah, I mean in the mid 17th century there was a famous law that's passed and actually in 1643 that banned peasants from making tofu. Just to try to make them economize. They're not supposed to brew their own sake. They're not supposed to make their own tofu, not make their own sweets. It's tough being a peasant. But of course, were these actually enforced? Mm, well, on the one we know that the government keeps passing these laws. So that tells you one thing that no one's paying attention.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that also just saying these laws kind of gives the government some feeling of empowerment. At least they're taking the noble high horse. Don't do this, don't do that. But when it comes down to daily life and what folks are doing, maybe they're doing just the opposite, right?
Yeah.
Because who wouldn't? It's so easy to brew at home. All the ingredients are there. If you're a farmer, you don't even have to use rice, right? You use whatever grains available. So,
Would that still be called sake if it wasn't with rice?
well, I would call it sake. A lot of people legally today would not call it sake, but yeah, I think there's all kinds of grains that were used for brewing in Japan way up until modern times. Some millets and what have you. And yeah, I think that's sake, except it's a little bit it's against our own kind of modern conceptions of what sake is today.
And
But I
at
think
the
that's a good thing. It's a kind of reality check. Sake doesn't always have to be about rice.
at the time, would they have called it sake?
Sure, sure. Yeah.
Well, because at the time, was it basically like any brewed boozy thing would be sake?
Yeah, unless you're distilling it, then it would be some kind of shochu. But yeah, anything that uses koji and techniques of sake brewing could be called sake. Except, rice tastes a heck of a lot better. I
Yeah.
made I made sake with a little bit of sorghum here in Kansas because we don't have rice obviously in Kansas, but we have great sorghum. And so I made some kind of a blend of sake and sorghum, and it was interesting. It was very rough, but it showed me that you could do it. And I was kind of curious about that, having read sources about people using other grains for sake brewing historically. And lo and behold, wow.
That's super interesting. We had Philip Harper, the Toji up in Kyoto, on the show a couple weeks ago, and he talked a little bit about how he went back to the books to kind of figure out what sake was like pre-Meiji, pre-Japan kind of opening up fully to the West and starting to industrialize. Is there are there people doing that though? Like what you just said that you were doing with adding sorghum, adding things that historically probably would have been in sake, especially like more commoner sake, probably outside of Japan, but doing like that kind of archaeological brewing.
Yeah, there are people who are doing some interesting things in the United States with sake. Most brewers, for example, use lactic acid in their sake, and there's nothing wrong with that. It just kind of makes a good environment for the yeast. There were traditional ways of building up that lactic acid that were very labor intensive, but now most brewers in Japan will add just a dose of that to avoid all that stuff. But we have brewers in America who eschew lactic acid and go for those old school techniques. So we have that on the one hand, but then we also have folks who are making nigori sake with all kinds of flavorings like
Mhm.
horchata and coffee and stuff like that. So there's really such a range. I think people are trying to figure out, what American sake can be, what sake can be, what's going to appeal to people. And some
Yeah.
people like those really funky ancient brews, and others want something a little more like a cocktail. And that's all good.
Would you say that your average well-to-do samurai in Edo would like the sake being made today? or would it be kind of like, I don't know about this? Wouldn't be what they were used to, or it wouldn't be kind of along that same line of like, oh, this is my range of like stuff that I think is good.
Almost anything, yeah, almost anything is good the more you drink of it. I discovered. I had some Chinese baijiu.
Uh-huh.
Wow, man, that first like sip, you feel like you're drinking a fermented sock. At least that's what I thought. But it grows on you. So
Yeah.
maybe our samurai might feel the same way. He or she, might take a sip and go, "Well, this is good." Chances are, I think if they're drinking something very nice, they would be very impressed
Hmm.
because sake today is it's more refined in many ways. The polishing rates, for one thing, are much higher, and so we can get very kind of ethereal sake, as you know, these ginjos, daiginjos, nothing like that in the Edo period. So serve the samurai some daiginjo. Wow, I think that would really impress them. Maybe also they would like a flavored horchata nigorizake, although they don't know horchata,
Yeah.
But they might like that too. It's kind of hard to say.
Was there more of a tradition of adding stuff to sake in like the pre-modern period?
Well, definitely at the New Year's you add certain herbs and things like that to your sake for a New Year's toast. And then also certain seasonal observations, like in the fall, there's chrysanthemum sake, where if you add a chrysanthemum, it adds, it's an ancient Chinese custom that supposedly promotes longevity. So things like that.
Hmm.
But generally, no, people would either, have their sake room temperature, warm in the winter months, and room temperature the rest of the year. And that, of course, changes the profile too.
Hmm.
But no, there's not a lot of adulteration like that, except the brewers from Nada are taking a lot of distilled alcohol and adding it to their sake. And that's going to make it have a stronger, it's going to make it drier rather. And but they do that because of the shipping. It's easier, it's going to
Mm.
survive longer when it's shipped from Nada up to Edo.
Are they producing that distilled alcohol on site, or are they buying it from like Kagoshima or somewhere else?
Yeah, I think they're brewing it on site. I haven't seen directions for that in early modern sake texts that I looked at, but I think that's what they're doing. Um, it's interesting the things that they talk about and that they don't talk about, and it's always those things that they don't talk about that leave me wondering, like, wait, are they making their own koji here? Are they buying it? And if they buy it, what kind of form is it in? They don't talk about that so much.
Oh,
Some
really?
texts, so you have to kind of uh, think hypothetically about what brewers would be doing.
When does umeshu come onto the scene in the sake history? Because like these days you have sake breweries that are making umeshu with sake, but
Right.
I think of it more some sort of white distilled liquor and sugar and ume.
Yeah, I think, shochu brewing really takes off from the late 19th century, 20th century. And so that's going to provide the raw ingredients for making umeshu. And when I think of umeshu, it's like a very homegrown kind of thing. It's something that Granny makes. And she just takes all those apricots, those ume, and puts them in a jar and let's soak for weeks and weeks, and she's got it tucked away someplace, and then late at night she'll pull it out and have a tipple, and maybe even the kids were kind of dipping little
Yeah, yeah.
thumbnail size drinks in there to have a tipple. I know some Japanese friends who kind of grew up sampling the family umeshu, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but it's interesting, it kind of causes a moment of distress for the Japanese government because, well, in the 1960s, if home brewing is illegal, what about grandma's umeshu?
Mm.
Because she's making this drink at home. Is this home brewing or is she just combining ingredients? And think about it. It's kind of like banning mom's apple pie.
Yeah,
If you
yeah.
say that's illegal, mom can't make apple pie anymore in the United States. Like, can you believe it? But no, umeshu, I mean, it's so much part of the fabric of daily life and feminine life too.
Mhm.
Well, the government decided that's not, you know, home brewing. It's just combining ingredients. But it's illegal. They said it's illegal if you add rice to that, or if you add sort of anything that's going to promote further fermentation. As long
Oh,
as you take your ume, as long as you take your alcohol and you combine that, that's okay. But the moment you put grain in there, that's home brewing. And it's really a crazy distinction, but yet that's the law today.
huh. And you didn't come across anything like of people making doburoku at home and keeping plums in it to like just increase the calorie count or anything like that.
Oh, wow. I mean, there's a sort of Dobroku renaissance that happens in the 1970s and 80s. And
Uh-huh.
there's this farm journal in Japan, kind of the publication for rural folk and farmers. And every month they have a new Dobroku recipe.
Oh, wow.
And
Okay.
all these kind of great recipes. You can make dobroku out of leftover rice. You can use imported rice. You can use other grains. All these old time farmers are telling their secrets to making dobroku, and it's all done anonymously. So here we have this guy in Iwate who makes this kind of dobroku, and the next month we're gonna learn somebody from Hyogo Prefecture who's making his dobroku. And there have these wonderful, charming illustrations of these people and these old guys drinking their dobroku, and all the while this is illegal. But
Yeah, was that not a problem for the publisher?
apparently not. No, they
Huh.
just did it kind of anonymously, and I mean the people featured were anonymous. Um, and there are people on the left who are using Dobroku to try to push government policy. There's this very famous activist named Maeda Toshihiko who was involved in the protests against Narita Airport, and he started brewing Dobroku kind of to advocate for the fact that it should be legal. You know, it's part of his
Hmm.
constitutional guaranteed right to pursue happiness is to home brew. And yet the government
Yeah,
cracked
yeah.
down on him. And, he kind of rubbed it in the government's face because he invited he invited the head of the National Tax Agency, which regulates liquor in Japan, invited that person to his Dobroku party. And it's kind of like he wanted to make a scene about
Okay.
it.
Yeah, yeah, that's being the nail that's gonna get pounded down, I feel like.
Yeah, but it went all the way to the Japan Supreme Court. And so ultimately the government said, no, you can't homebrew,
Uh,
which I think is really unfortunate, you know? It really is.
so at least on the books, it sounds like alcohol production, alcohol consumption in Japan has been heavily regulated since maybe the 1600s. As you were saying earlier, it maybe not, it might be on the books, but people are basically free to ignore it up until the end of the 1800s maybe, but
Yeah, you could even push that back further, like to the 14th century or 15th century, 15th century, definitely, when the government realizes they can make money from the brewers. You
mm,
know, they can tax the brewers, they can tax them and get a lot of revenue that way. And so once they see that as a source of revenue, they're going to promote brewing because that helps the government. So the medieval shogunate's doing that. And I think, it's been that government policy since then, sometimes to the improvement of sake, sometimes to the detriment of sake, historically,
mhm.
in retrospect, at least.
Because the government's really interested in improving the quantity of sake produced during like the Meiji period, right?
Oh, sure. And they're doing all sorts of things to try to improve sake too.
But that's not necessarily for imports or exports in the way that like silk production is also heavily subsidized so that they can sell silk overseas. But they're not selling sake overseas per se, right?
No, not yet, but it is, in terms of like where it ranks above silk. I mean, for a while, the sake industry is producing much more economically than the silk industry, even though it's a domestic
Oh, okay.
product, which is pretty
Yeah.
amazing.
When is the big like when does sake exports become a thing that the tax man cares about?
Yeah, I think, it's pretty recent. It's after World War II, definitely. Um, because, well, sake enters a dark valley in World War II, and the government decides that the rice that's being used for sake, that needs to be eaten.
Hmm.
Yet we need alcohol, so they promote beer. And that's when beer really takes off. So if you're fighting in the Japanese army or navy, you're going to be drinking beer most of the time.
Oh,
And
really?
the Japanese government's pretty good about supplying beer to the troops and at home.
Uh-huh.
Because when they think about beer, they think about it as a modern, advanced beverage, one that doesn't use rice. It's what the Germans drink.
Hmm.
So that's what gets promoted, and it's maybe easier because there's one brew company. They take all the breweries, there's like four or five breweries, major corporations, and they roll them into one. And so it's easier to control than all these sake breweries when you have hundreds and hundreds of sake breweries. So yeah, the sake industry really takes a hit, and I don't think it's until the 1950s and 60s that Japan even thinks about exporting sake.
During the war period, like, is the style of production basically also streamlined and made into one way of making sake, or like can differences like Kimoto and Yamahai or Bodaimoto, that kind of thing, still exist?
They exist, but not. It's difficult, I guess, is the answer because there's not a lot of resources. You can't get polished rice. Even consumers can't buy polished rice. So
Hmm.
what they do is they take the old sake bottles and they put their brown rice into it, and they give Junior a stick and tell him to get to work for a couple hours, and Junior will polish the family's rice for them, even though you're not supposed to do that. Here's a good example of people doing things that they're not supposed to do. They're not supposed to polish
Yeah.
rice, but they do. Why doesn't the government want you to polish rice? Because, well, lots of nutrients are lost, and the government's very interested in nutrition in wartime. So the brewers, they don't have access to polished rice. A lot of the breweries staff they have to let go half of their staff,
Hmm.
direct those to wartime industries. And then what is the dominant sake that's being made? It's this two-thirds sake. And what that is, it's a sake that's developed in the Japanese colony of Manchuria. It's an artificial sake in that, two-thirds of the ingredients are not sake. They're sugars,
Uh,
they're flavorings, brewer's alcohol, and the like. And this recipe is invented there, and then it becomes the norm during the war for other brewers. And then the unfortunate thing is that it continues in the post-war period, and
mhm.
actually until quite recently, this two-thirds sake, which was great for the brewers economically, but in retrospect, kind of ruined people's taste for sake and gives you a bad hangover, I understand too.
Is it made today, or is it entirely gone?
I don't think it's made today, no. Or at least if it's made, it's not called sake the way it was. But legally, it was called
Okay.
sake for a long, long time. Yeah.
That I have noticed. So from time to time, I have the opportunity to do like a tasting for visitors to Japan who are interested in sake. And it definitely seems like the definition of sake is very broad in terms of what it can and can't be, and then in terms of like flavor profile, especially.
Yeah.
And that's just kind of like how it's always been, it sounds like. There has never really been like, oh, this flavor of sake is we're going to call this or anything like that.
Well, I don't know. I think, of course, people have their favorite breweries. If we go back to the 1920s, people have their favorite breweries, or before that, their folks
Mhm.
have their favorite breweries, whatever they are. But these distinctions like Ginjo, Daiginjo, they really don't become prominent until, the post-war period, although they're around in some brewing circles when they're trying to make a sake for an award, they'll do that.
Uh-huh.
So those are and legally those become more prominent more recently. Something like what's the word for sake when you don't add alcohol to it? I'm drawing a blank here. It's early in the morning in Kansas.
Junmai?
Yeah, junmaishu. That's a term that most people will know in the 1970s, 1980s. They don't know what Junmaishu is.
Hmm.
They might be making it, but they don't have a kind of sense for what that is as a product. So it's that too is a very recent term. So a lot of the terms that we think about as kind of hard and fast are very recent in the long history of sake brewing.
What what would be the like equivalent terms that people used to use that we don't use anymore?
Well, you know, the thing is in the up until the 17th century, sake is brewed year round. And so there's actually all these terms for sake, depending on the season and depending on the brewing method. Because if you think back to the 17th century or earlier, there's no refrigeration. So
Hmm.
in the summer months, you're going to be using something like a bodaimoto, you know, and then you can change your techniques as the months get colder. There's all these sort of nuanced terms for these different types of sake that are being produced.
Hmm.
And then it all ends. Then at the end of the 17th century, the government says you have to brew sake in wintertime. They're not saying that because it tastes better. It happens to taste better than summer brew. They're saying that to try to cut sake consumption and production. And then the labor force, you know, kind of follows that and it becomes labor intensive in those winter months. And then, you know, that's what we think of as sake, something produced in the wintertime. But before that, no, there's all kinds of different sake that are being made. And that's part of the project in my book is to try to recover that. Like, what do people mean by sake in the medieval period? What are they drinking? You know, what could it be? And people have a sense for, you know, different areas of production even back then. You know, different temple breweries, for example, have
Hmm.
famous types of sake.
And that and it's referred to as like this temple sake is better than that other place's sake, or is it just like, wow, I had this and it was really good?
Yeah, so for example, a lot of these temples are in the Nara area, and Hideyoshi liked this one temple. Hideyoshi being the warlord who conquered Japan in the late 16th century. He liked this one temple called Amano, and Amano had this sake, and he wrote to them and said, "Stop adding ash to your sake." And the reason why the brewers are doing that is to try to clarify the sake. But he didn't like that because it changed the acidity of the sake. And I guess
Oh.
I don't know what they responded, but maybe they sent him a batch without the the ash in it.
So the temples were actively selling the sake or giving maybe just giving it as gifts, but it was leaving the temple grounds for general consumption.
Yes, it seems that way. Temples, you think about it, they have a lot of rice. They get paid in rents, in rice, and so it's a really smart business scheme to take all that and turn it into a finished product that you can sell or you can give. And it takes a little bit of rationalization too, because these are Buddhist
Mhm.
institutions, right?
Yeah.
And you're not supposed to, you know, technically, hey, you're not supposed to be drinking when you're a monk. You're supposed to be contemplating your navel. You're supposed to be praying. How did the Japanese monks get around this? Well, the way Buddhism works in Japan, it's kind of hand in glove with Shinto, the native
Hmm.
tradition. And Shinto deities like to drink. So you have to have alcohol for them. You have to have sake for them. And so it's better if you make your own sake and then you can give it up as offering to the deities. And of course, along the way, you have to taste it yourself. And you make a lot. And so some of it you consume, and that's fine. They justified that. But then the rest you can give or sell. So they did some temples did quite well in that regard.
Would the actual like monks and priests of the temples be the ones making the sake? Like the Trappist monks making beer? Or is it more like they're bringing lay people in, or they're having like the people who are paying them rent do it for them?
No, I think it's the monks themselves because it involves a lot of skill. And we know from their records that, you know, they're trying new things, trying to improve all the time. So it's the same group of workers who are doing this, and they have lots of innovations. So the ones who innovate pasteurization. Well, it could have been around earlier. I mean, from the historical record, it's hard to say, but definitely one of the earliest examples of pasteurization comes from these monastic records. Likewise, increasing the brew amount by having initial batch of ingredients and then adding another batch of ingredients, then a third batch of ingredients. That's something that the temples innovated. The way the temples did it, they would add the same amounts, each
Uh,
time. When early modern secular brewers did this, they discovered you could double the amounts you added, and that's become the sort of standard for today. So they're very innovative, and we know that they drink a lot too.
so if the monks though are brewing, you would imagine they would want to control that knowledge. So how is knowledge shared or not shared between brewers before like Gekkeikan kind of gets into the we're going to do scientific brewing and tell everybody in Kyoto how to do it?
Yeah, we have one good medieval brewing text, and it
Okay,
has some,
one.
yeah, and it has some recipes for different temple sake, and you kind of wonder, how those recipes were obtained. Yeah, it's kind of a mystery, but I think a lot of the learning it's by word of mouth in that
Mhm.
period. So it's not well documented. But surely, you have one temple monk might go to another temple to help establish brewing there, and in some way, secular brewers learned about all this stuff in the early 17th century, and then it just proliferated. But yeah, it's kind of hard to know how to brew at that very high level because the knowledge is just not well disseminated. We have lots of cookbooks that are published in the early modern period. And people could read those, they could borrow them from lending libraries, they could see, what the shogun eats, have a sense for that. But in terms of like brewing, there's two sources of information if you're an ordinary person. One is grandma, what she does at home, her doburoku, and maybe just maybe, a contact at a professional brewery, but they're not printing up manuals on how to brew. Yet they're training people. So maybe if you
Mhm.
do a winter at a brewery, you get a sense for how to do it and can take that knowledge elsewhere eventually.
How available is sake then to like the average city dweller?
Oh,
Like, is it something
yeah.
you can expect to have most days, or
Sure, if you could afford it, you could go and sake is sold not in bottles. You bring your own container, or you can get a rental container. And the people who sold sake were really clever about this. They had a system like library books where they would put the name of their shop on the bottle and a reference number, and you could check out that
oh,
bottle
cool.
and have it filled,
Okay.
and then you bring it back and you get it refilled. And it all depended on how much you wanted to spend, the quite type of quality of sake that you wanted, and how much you wanted to get. But sure, yeah, sake is readily available, and if you could afford sake, you go to the local izakaya and you get doburoku. You get the white horse.
Interesting. This is like a half remembered thought from American history class in high school, but I feel like there was this comment that everybody was kind of like drinking beer all the time. Even kids were drinking beer all the time, and the explanation was a little bit of alcohol in your calorie-rich liquid is a better thing to eat than kind of sketchy water.
Oh yeah,
Is that also true in Japan in that consumption way, or maybe not so much?
I think the quality of water is much better in Japan than it is in a lot of countries. If it's the 19th century, I'd rather drink water from Edo than I would from London any day, you know?
Hmm.
So if you're living in London or another city, what do you have to drink? Well, you could boil that water and make tea. Otherwise, a weak beer works pretty well to keep you going. And I think, people thought of Doburoku in the same way because Doburoku, when it's sold, is watered down a lot. And so it's almost
Okay.
like an energy drink, if you will, you know?
Huh.
It's kind of a working man's Red Bull, so to speak.
Okay.
And so you'd have that and kind of get you going in the morning.
And it's watered down to increase like the amount you could sell, or is it watered down because it's like so thick and porridgey? and hard to drink if it's not watered down.
Yeah, I think both. I think on the seller's side, they want to produce more, so they're watering it down. Um, and then, yeah, it makes it a little bit more, it makes it easier to drink. But that's always kind of like the problem for selling sake is how much is it watered down. I read this one Buddhist text from the medieval period, and you'd think it would condemn sake brewing, but it doesn't. Instead, it condemns sake brewers who water their sake down too much. And it says, you do this too much, you're going to go to hell. And it provides a very graphic Dante-esque description of what's going to happen to you if you're watering down your sake too much.
That's a very this worldly concern for a Buddhist text to have. That's interesting. So that was like an issue then, is like adulteration or like kind of squeezing the consumer for the sake of the producer.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, it makes sense in a lot of ways, but you just don't want to do it too much. In wartime, people complained about the sake being too watered down, and they called it goldfish sake because, allegedly a goldfish could
Okay.
like live in it because there was no alcohol.
I wonder what it tasted like. I'm sure it would not have tasted nice, but
Watery.
watery, yeah, very
Very
well. Because
watery.
these days, right, we're going towards this lower ABV style of sake is becoming more popular. So it's kind of not for the same reasons, but kind of going full circle, right?
Yeah, well,
A
people,
little bit.
the brewers are really trying to figure out how to appeal to consumers in an age when in Japan, the United States, people are drinking less alcohol than they ever did, you know.
Kind of talking about drinking more alcohol. Um, what is, if you know, because this was not really mentioned in the book, I was just curious about it. What is the history of like nomi hodai or like the free flow culture of you go to a restaurant and like you just can drink until for the set time period? Did you
Wow.
find anything that talks about when that shows up?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Like all you can drink. We do have examples of drinking contests from the 19th century. And those are definitely all you can drink. And I've
Yeah,
done some research about binge drinking historically, and it doesn't appear in this. It's going to appear in my book. It's going to appear in an article that's coming out in this historical journal, maybe next year. And it's very interesting because what defines a good drinker in the medieval period is a lot different from what defines a good drinker in the 19th century.
hmm.
In the medieval period, it's not how much you can drink, it's how much you can vomit, basically. Because that's what makes you the life of the
Gross.
party when you're
Okay.
hurling your guts out. And we see that in picture scrolls. We read about it, and um, people brag. There's this aristocrat who can vomit on command, and he's very popular. All right.
Okay.
But fast forward to the 19th century, people are drinking copious amounts of alcohol. And here you have to wonder, it must be watered down somehow because this would kill.
Hmm.
This would kill anybody today. But they're drinking it and they're trying to remain absolutely cold sober, at least according to the accounts.
Uh-huh.
None of this like wild behavior. You know, the most that's going to happen is someone goes tottering off and takes a nap someplace, but they don't get so drunk that they get ill and get sick everywhere.
Yeah.
That's passe.
That's And that's after like Meiji and Japan starts westernizing, or that's still like latter half of the Edo period
Yeah, that's
when you say the
early
19th
19th
century.
century, so not even this period of westernization yet. And of course, why is this the case? And first of all, you have to preface it by saying this is kind of a limited look at society, looking at elite culture in the medieval
Hmm.
period and early modern period. But why do people want to become sober like that, or depict themselves as sober? And I think some of it has to do with the rise of Confucianism, which happens in the early modern period. Confucian ideas are taught in the local schools. And if you read Confucius, there's a famous line in there about how Confucius eats only a little bit, but he drinks a lot. Just he doesn't show that he's drunk. And I think,
Oh,
there's that sort of mindset. Like you can have a drink and just as long as you don't show that you're intoxicated. And we find that echoed in the literature that's written for samurai, and we find it echoed in the health manuals of the period. Like a little bit of sake is good, but don't drink to excess.
Hmm.
And so there's this desire to remain sober. And if we also think about the repressive nature of early modern society, you don't want to stand out. So if you're going to get ripping drunk, you do that and then you go into some corner someplace and have a nap. Or better yet, you go home and have a nap.
In the early modern period, like the floating world, the pleasure districts, those were treated as like a place where you could get drunk, or even then was it more, it was still seen as kind of inappropriate depending on who you were, like your background.
It's more appropriate in those situations than others. Those are literally walled off parts of society where men go into and seek all kinds of pleasures. And so in that way, you're kind of in a liminal place. And so you, just like a tourist today, when you're traveling, you kind of get up to naughty business, that you wouldn't do at home. What stays in
Yeah, yeah,
Vegas and what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, that kind of thing. I think what
yeah.
happens in Yoshiwara stays in Yoshiwara, or it should for those folks. Um, so yes, but there are also times of great samurai ritual where people are obviously going to get drunk, but they maintain that sober exterior. So, for example, say a lord was entertaining another very powerful official, they'll start off with a sake drinking ceremony. And the sake drinking ceremony will have 9 cups of sake that they're each drinking. And
Yeah, I remember this in the book.
Mhm.
It to me it felt more like a contest than like a proper ceremony. It's like I am going to drink you under the table and I'm going to make you get very drunk. Just watch me.
I think there is that. There is that aesthetic of a contest. And can you keep up with me? Because it's a hierarchical relationship that they're reinforcing through this ritual. There's the host and the guest, and usually the guest is of a higher status. And so, can they negotiate this relationship? And you do it through sake drinking. You do it by giving lots of nice stuff to your guest. Give them a horse, give them a sword. And I think maybe there's a lot of, yeah, back and forth about, is this person a real drinker or not?
Hmm.
Can they hold their alcohol? And later on, can they vomit it up? Because we want to see that if it's the medieval period, you know? Um, so yeah, unfortunately, that kind of like contest part of it doesn't appear too much in that instance in those records, but there are drinking games in the medieval period that people played that we know about.
So sake is especially today thought of as Japan's national drink, but Japan has a lot of relations with the Asian continent, with various Chinese dynasties and things like that. And I know there's cultural influence. Is there alcohol influence as well there?
Well, definitely in the case of shochu, that's easier to document. It seems like, if we look at the history of shochu, it comes from the Mongols who bring that distillation process, and they introduce it to China, introduce it to Korea, eventually to the Ryukyu Islands, and then to Japan. And simultaneously, too, in the 16th century, Portuguese, Spanish are also bringing in wines and methods of fermentation. So that kind of thread is very clear. But in terms of the history of sake, it's really hard to say because, yeah, Chinese are doing lots of very interesting brewing, but how it's related to the early history of sake is rather unclear. At least that's according to the Japanese scholars. I mean, part of it is sake
Hmm.
nationalism,
Hmm.
but I also trust their reading of the sources because if it's a case of sushi, definitely, you can see antecedents in China and it's very clear. But in terms of
Hmm.
sake brewing, it's much less clear. What people are brewing in China before sake is like beers and things like that.
Uh,
But even in the ancient period in Japan, they're using lots of techniques that we don't really think about with sake brewing. They might be taking, they're malting, for example, and using that in sake brewing in
oh,
some recipes. And there might be
malting
different.
the rice?
Um, they're using wheat.
Whoa.
So they're malting other grains besides rice because you can't malt rice very effectively.
Huh.
Yeah, and so there's all kinds of like recipes that exist or sort of fragments of recipes that we get from the 10th century. And some of them have malting techniques, and they might use different types of koji too than are used in sake brewing today. So there's a
Mhm.
lot of experimentation that's going on in that early period.
That's interesting. So it's kind of like the craft beer and craft sake, the kind of not considered seishu Japanese sake legally, but like the other kind of brewed beverages that's going on now
Yeah,
are a little maybe closer to that in 10th century brewing style.
sure. People are using like hops today in sake brewing. So it's stuff like that.
And then sake brewing overseas, it begins in America, or I suppose it begins in like the Japanese Empire colonies outside the main islands,
Right,
and then
right.
the United States is the kind of first place you see brewing, or
Yeah, I mean, that's where I found it in California. And, that's more than a century ago when Japanese immigrants come and they set up all kinds of Japanese industries, and some of them are sake brewing. Also in Hawaii, there's that tradition
Mhm.
too. Um, yeah, almost every kind of major city along the coast in California has a brewery, one or more, that's run by Japanese immigrants. But unfortunately, that history gets kind of wiped away with Prohibition and with the Second World War. And then it's not
Mhm.
until the 1970s that it's revived again.
Is there any like contemporaneous documents commenting on like the quality of those early American breweries compared to the Japanese breweries?
Not in that period that I've read, but
Hmm.
it's interesting when the major players start opening breweries in the United States in like the 1970s. Gekkeikan is producing Junmaishu in the United States because it can't add any alcohol to its sake. And that's true
Oh,
today. I mean, I think almost all the sake that's brewed in America is Junmaishu. And Japanese journalists
be-
are coming to the United States and they're drinking Gekkeikan. They're going, whoa, this is quite different from what we're getting in Japan, where we have this two-thirds sake that Gekkeikan and other breweries are making. This is real. This is the real deal. And so they're very impressed by American sake. And they're like, how can I get this stuff in Japan? And you can't,
yeah.
at least in that period. People don't know what Jinmaishu is in Japan. At least not that term is not widely used.
Mhm. It's not used. Yeah. Huh.
So initially, I think, yeah, American sake impressed people in the 70s. And I mean, it still impresses. And a lot of innovations that happened in sake brewing happened in the United States or abroad, like year-round brewing. That's something that takes off in Hawaii. Also in Hawaii was carbonated sake. That's introduced in the post-war period. Flavored sake is something too, I think, is an American invention that's been re-imported
Mhm.
back to Japan, although you can't call it sake if it's got flavorings in it in Japan,
Yeah.
which is interesting in and of itself.
Yeah, no, the kind of back and forth between Japan and America in all sorts of industries is very interesting. But sake, I think, is seen as such a traditional, or at least I see it as such a traditional industry, that's very interesting to kind of hear about how innovations or things that are happening in America then kind of filter back to Japan. And they're like, oh, maybe we should be doing that kind of thing as well.
Tradition's a great thing. Those generations of tradition of brewing, you can't replace that, and that's something that Japanese brewers have. But then you get these guys and women in America who were involved in the culinary industry, or maybe they had some IT job, and they just developed this passion for sake. They're able to home brew in the United States, and it's not easy, but you can do it. And then they decide to make a go of it. And there, their minds are kind of completely open about what you can do with sake.
Mhm.
And also their consumers too. They don't know sake very much. They might have had some piping hot beverage at a sushi restaurant once and think that's sake. And so it's their job, the brewer's job, to try to say, no, that's not maybe the best example of sake. Try this flavored sake, or try this. kimoto that I make.
Mhm.
And, then people can have that dialogue, but it's really exciting. You get that growth and all this potential of people trying to reinvent sake. And some purists will say, "Oh no, no, you can't do it that way." But yet, if it's bringing customers in the door, what's wrong with that? I would say,
Kind of that is the challenge, right? Of
right.
like, do you just keep it as this one thing that the modern world maybe no longer has a need for, or do you grow and change and develop and expand?
Yeah, and even the Japanese government, when it's trying to promote sake in the 1950s and 60s, they're offering it as a replacement for gin or vodka. And they're coming up with all these kind of cocktails for sake for
Hmm.
Westerners. So like sake cocktails were a big thing for a long time. I mean, they still are
Yeah.
for some. Some brewers have recipes on their homepages for making sake cocktails.
When does the like sake and wine association really start to become like linked? If the Japanese government is kind of almost treating it as a distilled beverage in the 50s and 60s, when does it change tack to be a little more like it's the wine of Asia?
Yeah, that's very recent. That whole wine culture
Huh.
thing. And to give you an example of that, I was working in a Japanese restaurant in Kyoto, a nice place, and that was in the 90s. And it was a couple place, kind of a lower end kaiseki place, but still you could
Mhm.
spend a lot of money there. You go to the chef and say, "I'm in your hands, omakase shimasu," and you could walk out a lot lighter in the wallet.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but what are people drinking at that time? He has two types of sake that he has available, just two, one with little gold flakes in it and
Uh-huh.
another one, and beer. Most people are drinking beer. There's not that kind of
Huh.
conception of pairing at all. Um, Yet around the same time, I'm going to wine events in Kyoto and people are talking about pairing and pairing wine with food. And I think then there's this gradual permeation of wine culture into sake and this notion that sake is something that needs to be paired or can be paired with food, when
Mhm.
historically nobody thought that way. You just drank sake. You didn't think about pairing it with anything. You drank it before, you drank it after, and you went during your eating your meal, and nobody thought
Mhm.
about it like that. People prefer beer because it's lower alcohol, or they like the taste, or it's a so-called modern beverage. Some, but yeah, this whole idea of pairing sake with different foods is very recent, but it's very much on the minds of American brewers because they're always trying to
Mhm.
push people to think of sake as not just for Japanese food. It's something for everything. Hot dogs, pizza. There's a sake
Yeah,
out there for that. One brewer told me.
that makes sense. Yeah.
And it's true. I mean, wine, there's all these rules, right? Red wine with mead and white wine and yada yada yada. But sake, it's all out there. It's all kind of good. You don't like it at that temperature? Well, change the temperature. Maybe it'll be better.
Do you have a preferred sake temperature?
I mean, I think it's depends on the sake, really. I guess, something more ethereal, like a Daiginjo
Hmm.
Ginjo, kind of on the cooler side of things, but something more Futsushu, kind of warmed up. And it depends on the time of year too. And I have to admit, I'm not a sake connoisseur either. The sake that's available locally is very limited. Um,
Hmm.
so I just, get a bottle and enjoy it whatever temperature, actually.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's reasonable. I think that's totally fine. Are there, this is kind of stepping back a little bit into the history again, but was there records of sake being consumed on Dejima in Nagasaki during the Edo period?
On the Dutch enclave in
On the Dutch
Dejima,
on the Dutch side? Yeah.
um, the Dutch brought their own alcohol and they brought
Oh.
beer, they brought wine, um, and occasionally they would share these things out. And apparently, some Japanese who worked very closely with the Dutch developed a fondness for wine. and there's kind of a distribution network that develops amongst these people for wine.
Oh, interesting.
I don't know if the Dutch developed a taste for sake. They probably did drink it though.
Mhm.
But yeah, they brought a lot of their own food and alcohol, and they're making a lot of Western foods there. They're baking and the like.
But even culinarily, it's kind of separated,
Hmm.
and there's not a lot of necessarily like sharing that kind of thing even.
Right, right.
Huh, interesting. It's been quite a bit over an hour. So thank you so much for hanging out and talking about the book and talking about Japanese history and Japanese sake history, especially taking all of my kind of odder questions as well. But kind of maybe as a final question, what should I have asked you about?
Well, first of all, I appreciate the conversation and all the questions that you have asked. Yeah, the thing about that I've learned studying the history of sake and history of sushi too is that, and I don't know if this is a question or not, so I'll just make it as a statement. They, there's been so many changes, and what we think of as these iconic foods and drinks today, quite different just a century ago, or even less than a century ago. And I think in knowing that, we can all of a sudden think about the potential for these different things. Because if our mind is like stuck that sushi is this way and sake is this way, and it's always been that way and always should be that way, then it's gonna die, I think. It's got to evolve with the times. I met this chef in Japan, and he had this restaurant in Kyoto that went back to the 17th century. And he made one dish. He made this turtle soup, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And or spon nabe. And I was really excited because I thought he was making this one dish for centuries in his family. And finally, you can get the taste of the Edo period, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And literally, I believe this rumor that they used the same pots they had in the 17th century and they never washed them. But that was not true. But one of the things that he told me is that when I asked him this question, it's like, what is the taste of the 17th century? Or I said something crazy like that. And he said, well, actually, every day the flavor changes. I look at the weather, I look at the customers coming in, I change a little bit just because food has to evolve. And if we kept it one way, then we would go out of business. And I think, there's a lesson to be learned there. Here's this restaurant that goes back to the 17th century. There are marks on the door where the samurai were attacking it with swords because they couldn't get in one night. And yet, he's kind of tweaking the recipe almost every day. And I think sake brewers too, they're changing and evolving the recipes.
Yeah.
So sake in America is a little more acidic than sake in Japan. And it's just some brewers here are doing it in a more bolder fashion than others. But we all kind of have to grow and evolve. And that's not to say that we shouldn't keep these traditions too. They're very important. But at the same time, we shouldn't be fixated with them too.
Hmm.
Things should change a little bit.
Keeping the spirit of the tradition rather than maybe the law of the tradition.
Yeah. Yeah, something like that. And that's up for the master brewers and also for the wacky experimenters to figure out.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. That's a great place to end it, I think. Thank you so much.
Well, cool. I've enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Your book, Kampai, The History of Sake, is out wherever good books are sold, either as a digital copy or a hardcover copy. I'm sure everybody who is in Japan or outside Japan is excited to get it and read it. We'll put a couple links in the show notes to make it easy for people to find it as well. So
Awesome.
thank you so much for today.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Sake on Air. We'll be back with a new episode very soon, but in the meantime, please take a moment to review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. As always, send your questions and comments to questions@sakeonair.com or reach out to us on Instagram or Facebook at @sakeonair. Don't forget that we have a YouTube and a Substack as well. Sake on Air is made possible with the generous support of the Japan Sake and Shochu Makers Association and is broadcast from the Japan Sake and Shochu Information Center in downtown Tokyo. It is produced by Export Japan, and our team is Shuso Imada, Justin Potts, Arlene Lyons, Cindy Bissig, Chris Hughes, Chris Pellegrini, John Gottner, Marie Nagata, Miho Ota, Rebecca Wilson-Lai, Sebastian Lewan, and me, Frank Walter. Until next time, kampai!